First of all, massive congratulations to the hundreds of thousands of people who took to the baking streets of London today to protest against the policies of Donald J. Trump, the current president of the United States. The vast majority of you were on the streets for the best of reasons. I could not join you, partly because I'm working, but also because I could not march behind the Liberals, the mountebanks, the hypocrites, or, in the case of Nick Clegg, all three in the one person. I could not march behind people who, if President Hillary Clinton had touched down, would have been rolling out the red carpet for her, no matter how many wars she'd started, how many people she'd killed. I could not march behind those that did rush to touch the hem of the garment of the crooner, the suave President Barack Obama. I could not march behind the hypocrites whose real objection to Donald Trump is not that he's a pig, an ignorant, vulgar, ill-mannered, boorish, oafish pig, all of which he is, but whose real objection to Donald Trump is that he's, to quote one of them, the NATO Trotskyist Paul Mason, just in the media today, disrupting the international system, undermining NATO, running down our guardedness towards the big Russian bear. I cannot march behind those who openly cheer the McCarthyism of the American deep state, still trying desperately to reverse the decision of the American presidential election on an entirely bogus pretext. Mind you, nobody does bogus quite like Donald Trump. And a perfect example is what happened in his interview with The Sun. Even though it's on tape, he later described it as fake news. But it wasn't fake news. The Sun was telling the truth. Words you never thought you'd hear me say. The Sun was telling the truth when it quoted Donald Trump as saying that the Chequers version of Brexit was not what the British people had voted for her. Tick. Quite true. The Sun version of what that meant for a trade deal between Brexit Britain and the United States and the rest of the world, for that matter, was that it was therefore off, was also the truth. Correct. Tick. The only thing that Trump got wrong was in imagining that the pound shop Michael fabricant by the name of Boris Johnson might be a good, even great, Prime Minister in Theresa May's stead. Now, it goes without saying that Trump's behaviour on an official visit to a country that is rolling out the deepest of red carpets for him, including a royal audience with the Queen, was grotesque, bad manners. In fact, it was an assault upon our national dignity, our sovereignty, our entire self-image as a free and great country. Even Ruritania would balk at rolling out a red carpet from someone who, as soon as he arrived, sat down with the local press and undermined everything that the elected government in that country was doing. That's what Trump did. That's why Theresa May should have told him to leave the country immediately. A rare moment of agreement between me and Polly Toynbee, another of those at the front of the march today, behind which I could not have walked. But she was also right that all events today should have been cancelled. because of this grotesque interference in Britain's internal affairs by a foreign leader. Mind you, it would have been difficult to do that now that we know that the previous British Prime Minister, David Cameron, actually asked the crooner Barack Obama to so interfere in our domestic affairs on the eve of the Brexit referendum. David Cameron asked him to say that if we voted for Brexit, we'd be at the back of the queue. Queue, not line, being the clue that gave it away that the author of the line was English rather than American. So we've had governments, Tory governments, in the last couple of years that were desperately keen for foreign interference in our domestic affairs. That's why they allowed American banks to plough millions of pounds into trying to subvert our referendum on Brexit. That's why we allow, until now, the American billionaire George Soros to pile millions of pounds into subverting the decision we made in the referendum on Brexit. So they're not in that strong a position, not as strong as me, because one of the reasons I support Brexit is because I want to live in an independent country, independent from Brussels, independent from Washington, independent from Moscow, from Beijing, from anywhere. An independent, free, respectable and self-respecting country. But there are not many who share my political space. We'll be discussing the extent to which Donald Trump, like the clock that stopped, which is nonetheless right twice a day, was right in what he said to the Sun political editor Tom Newton Dunn. And we'll be discussing whether or not Theresa May can now survive. Last Friday, at this time, the sage of right-wing politics in the British media, Peter Oborne, told us, along with his apprentice, Dan the Corbyn man, Dan Hodges, that Theresa May had boxed it all off at Chequers. In the words of Peter Oborne, she had emerged, and I quote, as a brilliant Prime Minister. Chequers is dead in the water. Theresa May does not have the majority to pass the Chequers brand of Brexit, and neither should she, as the latest polling from YouGov shows. An overwhelming majority of British public opinion believes the Chequers version of Brexit is a sellout, is a betrayal. And where does she go now that she has no majority? Well, I'll tell you where. She goes across the floor to the Blairite traitors who are waiting in their scores to prop up a Tory government in 2018. Imagine. You think I'm making it up? Take a look at the video. Well, the deputy leader of the Labour Party, no doubt about it, says that his job is to stop this Tory government bringing itself down. There are scores of the Blairite fifth column, and they hope that there are enough of them to make up for the scores of Tory MPs who will not vote for Mrs. May's brand of Brexit in name only. So we're living in tumultuous and tremendously exciting times. Anything can happen, and it's foolish to definitively predict. But let me be foolish. Theresa May is on her way out of Downing Street. A leadership challenge will emerge in the next few days. And whether or not it commands a majority in the Conservative Party in Parliament, it will certainly command enough of a minority as to make her position as leader of the Tory party and Prime Minister of Britain utterly untenable. And it's entirely deserved. Good riddance, bad rubbish, Theresa May. And don't you know, it turns out that the Novichok was a message in a bottle in the house of Charlie Rowley, a house and a man that's been way too little investigated by our house-trained media, which has, like Pavlov's dogs, responded to every contradictory command from the British state about what happened in Salisbury, in Amesbury, with Novichok and with Russia. And while you weren't looking, North Korea stood up the United States for an important meeting that they had contracted to be at. And lastly, but by no means least, in this show, we'll be talking to the royal butler. Well, you've heard my point of view. He's definitely an American idiot, but that doesn't mean he's wrong about everything. In fact, on one or two of the biggest things, he's absolutely bang on the money. 0344 499 1000, that's the number to call. And you tell me if you think I'm wrong, if your call is a first-time call, if you're a woman caller, if you are a caller who disagrees with me, your call will be prioritised. 0344 499 1000. You call us and we'll call you back. And it won't cost you more than a penny or two. Peter Hitchens, the epic, classic Mail on Sunday columnist, is now on the line as our first guest. Peter, thanks for joining us. Have you torn yourself away from the demonstration?
Yes, I felt I'd demonstrated enough today.
Now, I don't know if you heard my thesis, but it's this in short. Although it's rank bad manners, how Donald Trump behaves, what he said to The Sun that he later denounced as fake news was correct. That Theresa May's Brexit won't wash, isn't Brexit at all, isn't what people voted for, and that, in the words of the late, great Alan Clark, NATO is just a bureaucracy looking for a donor.
Well, there's something in part of that, but I wouldn't claim to agree with more than about 4.5% of it. The NATO bit, I suppose I'd be in accord with. I think NATO should have been wound up long ago. Though I don't know at what point Alan Clark made that remark about it. It did have a serious purpose at one stage. It doesn't have one now. It has an unserious purpose now, which it ought to be discouraged from pursuing. But moving on to the European question, I'm completely baffled by the direction everything's taken on this. I have probably been one of the longest-standing opponents of British membership of the European Union in the British media. And my objections to the European Union have always been along the lines of the ultimate threat to very particular possessions of this country, especially its legal system, its ability to govern itself in general, were not largely economic. I had no special desire to eat chlorine-washed chicken from the United States, or indeed to import more stuff from the Far East. And the whole of the discussion about the exit of this country from the European Union seems to be taken over by economic and trade matters, in which I am, to be perfectly frank with you, completely uninterested, and I don't have any passions about them at all. If we could get rid of, for instance, the European arrest warrant and the growing tendency towards a presumption of guilt and pretrial detention and all the other things which are coming into our legal system, and if I could keep yards and miles for my distance measures and pounds and ounces and stones for my measures of weight and mass, and be allowed to be buried in 6 feet of English earth, I don't think I'd be that bothered if we couldn't make a special trade deal with the United States. I'm not quite sure what the fuss is about anyway. We do an enormous amount of trade with the United States, however the agreement is conducted, and that is not going to stop. So I'm puzzled by this whole direction. As for Mrs. May's plan, I'm not. No one could be enthusiastic about it, but I am well aware that negotiation is a matter of power. And the point that I've been making since all this began is that Britain doesn't have all that much power and doesn't have the economic or political or military or diplomatic strength to assert itself as a 100% wholly sovereign superpower type country. So we must expect our exit to be something of a compromise and to move, as I've often predicted, from being half in the European Union to being half out of it. So none of that surprises or particularly disappoints me. It's one of the reasons why I was against the referendum and took no part in it. I thought people seemed to imagine that this was independence via Harry Potter, the waving of a magic wand and the incantation of a spell, and suddenly reality was suspended. The world isn't like that, and I won't get angry about discovering that it isn't so.
What do you think of Donald Trump's rake's progress through Britain and Europe in the last few days?
Well, I think increasingly, I do intend people to think when I make this point that he reminds me of another major political figure who didn't really have an examination result to rub together, who couldn't really read or didn't read, who knew very little history, but who was fantastically, superlatively cunning. And that other person is, of course, Princess Diana. Who's similarly, although she had none of the supposed qualifications, she never went near the Oxford School of PPE or anything like that, she could run rings around any politician you cared to name, and so can he. But it's cunning rather than intelligence, and it's cunning rather than knowledge that does it. I think he's a fairly crude person, but I think that what he's been doing in continental Europe and here has all been, as all American presidents' actions has all been aimed at his own domestic political strength. That's what he does. In American politics, either you've got votes or you've got money that you can offer the president's party, or you're nothing. And Britain has neither votes nor money to offer President Trump or his party, so we're nothing. We're just a stage on which you can cavort.
Well, the Prime Minister offered plenty of money today in buying new missiles, American surface-to-air missiles, costing billions of pounds.
Well,
and she sent
true,
400 new soldiers to Afghanistan.
Yeah, that's a pity about the soldiers going to Afghanistan, and I have to get around to it sooner or later. I've been abroad myself for a few days, and I keep meaning to tackle it, but there is something seriously amiss that we're slipping back into that particular swamp. But the purchases of arms are not a new thing. We often buy arms from the Americans, and that we are at least buying them. They're not giving them to us, and as far as I know, we're not paying exorbitantly for them. And the other problem is we're increasingly bad at making our own weapons and ships, so we probably need to buy them from somewhere that still knows how to make them. So I can't get it particularly politically enraged about that.
Looking ahead, how do you think the Putin-Trump summit is going to go?
Well, I have no idea. Again, I'm not sure what his domestic purpose is in it. I do tend to think that the widespread belief among American liberals that Donald Trump's election as president was contrived by the Russians is the Democrats' equivalent of the claim by Donald Trump, among others, that Barack Obama wasn't really an American. It's like the birther stuff. It's a fantasy which they have to believe because they can't really get around the fact that they lost the election. Because they weren't any good at fighting elections. And that was the problem with the Democrats in the United States. They picked the one candidate who could have been beaten by Donald Trump in the shape of Hillary Clinton. They can't accept it's their fault. But what exactly Donald Trump has to say to Vladimir Putin, I don't know. He seems to be under the illusion, though he may just be saying this for effect, that Russia is a major power, when we all know that it's not. As I keep saying, Russia's gross domestic product is roughly that of Italy. It's a largely bankrupt country with many cities, admittedly cities that haven't been on display during the World Cup, but cities nonetheless, where people don't have work to do and don't have very much money to spend and have very little hope. And the economy is not growing. The population is not growing. It is a country in very deep difficulties, and it's physically weak apart from a collection of unusable nuclear weapons, which could never conceivably be employed, it seems to me, by anybody except a madman. So I'm not quite sure why Trump wants to measure himself against what is effectively a minor power. I think the habit has developed in Western countries of imagining that Donald Trump is more important than he is for domestic purposes. I think Britain in particular, as it grovels and snivels to the Chinese and the Saudis, likes to look tough with somebody and has chosen Russia to do this with. With Donald Trump, I'm not quite sure what the justification would be.
Lastly,
I can't read his mind. I could never read Princess Diana's either.
I doubt if anyone could read his mind.
I think in her case, a lot of what she wanted to do was to take revenge and destroy people who had mistreated her, whereas in Donald Trump's case, I don't think that's the motivation.
Lastly, Peter, you'll be aware, I hope, that Novichok, a bottle of it, has been found in the house of Mr. Charlie Rowley, one of the victims of the Amesbury affair. Yes. Are you across that, and any thoughts on it?
I've seen the report, yes. I mean, I have no idea. The whole thing is a bafflement to me. I think that to some extent I'm with Simon Jenkins in this, that I seem to be one of the very few people in the country who doesn't know what happened to the Skripals or who did it. But I don't. I mean, I've generally accepted that it came from somewhere within the Russian state, but it's always seemed to me to be ridiculous to imagine that it was actually done on the direct orders of the president of Russia, because I don't think that's the way things happen, and the Russian state isn't wholly under the control of the president of Russia. But beyond that, I think we know very little about how it came about. I'm hoping, I have to say, that the examination of this alleged bottle of Novichok will tell us more. But I think people are often pretending to be more knowledgeable about Novichok than they really are as well. It doesn't seem to me to be true that it could only have ever been produced in Russia. I think it could be produced elsewhere, and it doesn't actually necessarily clinchingly establish that it was a Russian action, that it is Novichok. But let's see. Any hard forensic evidence in this matter is gratefully received, I think, and ought to help clear the air.
We'll watch the space. Thanks a lot, Peter Hitchens, Mail on Sunday columnist extraordinaire. A great American, the boss, Bruce Springsteen, as we celebrate great Americans as well as excoriate the less than great. Tony X, the protest board. Tony, I'm loving your videos and your graphics, man. You are a very, very talented guy. He says, can someone hook up a radio to the PA in London? In Trafalgar Square, I think he means. Tune in to talk radio and marvel at the oratorical power of George Galloway. Thank you, Tony. Mary says, on a week of fire, football, poison and presidents, it's time for the legend. George Galloway on Talk Radio. Thanks, Mary. Unsociable Socialist says, everyone, George Galloway's live on Talk Radio with the mother of all talk shows. The best show on the radio and the only place to hear the truth. Thank you. And Lubna says, we're privileged. The teacher, Galloway, is on Talk Radio. Please join. Yes, spread the word, won't you? Unsociable Socialist again says, 2 minutes into the mother of all talk shows, and Galloway's got it spot on about these liberals. I couldn't stand Obama and would have hated Clinton just as much. Great listen. And Tony from Stirling says, I heard a protester earlier saying they're rejecting Trump due to his warmongering, deportations and support for Israel. This could also have described Barack Obama. Is there a danger that many protesters are missing the point? A very grave danger, Tony. And the Communicipalist says Donald Trump is a post-truth politician. This is a form of psychopolitics, also practiced badly by Theresa May's cabinet. So Trump can plant a story in The Sun and denounce it as fake news within 24 hours. It's all Hollywood-generated alternative truth. Yeah, denounce it as fake news, even though he and they have got it on tape. Richard Case says, President Trump showed no respect for our Queen. Well, I've seen a lot of people say that he didn't bow to our Queen. Why would the President of the American Republic, which fought a revolutionary war to overthrow the British royal family, bow to our Queen? Why would the President of a far more powerful, rich and influential country than ours bow? And who bows anyway? Somebody was denouncing Melania, who was looking fabulous, by the way, for not curtsying to the Queen. Are you serious? Do you want a world The likes of Theresa May going into the bends in order to curtsy to minor royals? What's wrong with you people? Albert says, well said, George Galloway. People would be mistaken for thinking Paul Mason was one of those recruited by MI5 while working at the BBC, such as his backing for McCarthyite anti-Russian propaganda. Well, he definitely wasn't recruited by MI5, let me say that. I know him well. But he is a very peculiar hybrid indeed. I mean, talk about a pantomime horse. The front part of the horse is a Trotskyite. And not just any Trotskyite, but one from one of the most obscure, obscurantist, in fact, fringe elements of the Trotskyite movement. And the back end of the horse is Britain's most vehement supporter of NATO and more expenditure on weapons. And he hates Donald Trump more for the latter than for any aspects of vulgarity displayed by President Trump. Graham from Fort William says, George, what drugs you taking tonight? I've never taken drugs, Graham, not of any kind. Your hatred for Donald Trump is frightening. Move on, get over your obsession. It's coming across that you're insane. Please see a doctor as soon as possible. And another madman who never puts his name, he's too much of a gutless coward for that, says Trump accuses the Sun of printing fake news. Well, they've been doing that for the past 50 years. By the way, how's your Brexit billionaire pals getting on? Well, on this occasion, at least, it was it was the Sun that was telling the truth and the Trump that was lying. He was lying today. He wasn't lying the day before. Jimmy says, time for Mr. Galloway. To be fair, George, we all know Donald Trump can sniff out fake news, so it must have been a fake Trump who gave that interview to the newspaper. And Jane A. says, inspirational opening speech from GG, just amazing and pretty much spot on. Thanks, Jane. Charlie says, Charlie for Culross, evening gorgeous. If you want to live in a real independent country, join the Yes 2 campaign in Scotland. We'd love to have you on board with your passion. I bet you would, Charlie, but you never will. Tad says, George, I share your political space. I detest the European Union. It isn't just wrong. It's downright dangerous. It's just a pity Remainers don't do a bit more research. Not for nothing did Mikhail Gorbachev once say he could not understand why anyone would want to recreate the USSR in Western Europe. Regards, Tad. Thank you for that, Tad. And my old pal Marie says, I have Anderson versus Eisner on mute while listening to George Galloway on Talk Radio right now, and plan to mute Joko and Rafa earlier. I don't even know what Marie's talking about there. Graham in Amesbury. Says, George, I was in the States just after Trump was elected. I spoke to several people who all said the same three things. Don't particularly like the man. Don't like his policies. Anyone but Hillary. Great show, as always. You see, this is the point. There were all kinds of hypocrites, mountebanks, and self-defined liberals at the head of that march of the magnificent 150,000 in London and around the country today. Fine people, fine people, who were misled by these hypocrites and mountebanks. When Nick Clegg announced that he'd be marching at the front of that march, that's when I knew I couldn't be there. One of the greatest of all Americans, the great blue-collar working-class hero, Bruce Springsteen. I've got a working-class hero on the line. He's now an eminent writer and commentator, but he comes from the same kind of streets as me. He's John White, joining us from Edinburgh. John, thanks for coming on the show.
Hi, George. Thanks for having me, mate.
Now, it's my thesis that however vulgar and oafish, however bad-mannered, however bull in a china shop Donald Trump appears to be and indeed is, the real reason why so many of the most powerful people in the world, including in the United States, really hate him, is because he's disrupting their NATO and war alliance. Where stand you on that?
I think I absolutely agree with that. I think it'd be right to label him, rather than the commander-in-chief, as the disruptor-in-chief. My word, he's arrived in Britain after an appearance at the NATO summit in Brussels, where he punctured decades of diplomatic niceties and US commitment to this Western military alliance. I think Donald Trump believes that it is a relic of a Cold War that no longer exists except in the hearts and mind of the tiny clutch of neocon fanatics who colonise these think tanks such as the Henry Jackson Society, the Atlantic Council, Stratfor and so on, and their co-thinkers in the mainstream media and within the political class. He used the financial angle. I don't think he's able to say what he really feels about NATO because of domestic pressure, so he came up with the financial angle, which does stack up, by the way. US commitment, financial and military, to this Western military alliance is completely disproportionate. My problem with NATO, I suspect it's the same as yours, is more moral and more ideological, because we have, within NATO, we have a military alliance that now exists to deal with the crises it itself creates by virtue of that existence, whether we're talking about precipitating the greatest refugee crisis since the Second World War with its disastrous intervention in Libya in 2011, turning that country from a functioning state into a Salafi jihadi theme park, bolstering and propping up Afghanistan not as a democracy but as a failed state whose greatest and biggest export is heroin, and also the ongoing crisis in Eastern Europe. And in Eastern Europe in particular, what NATO has done and is doing is allowing this clutch of former Eastern Bloc and Soviet bloc states, Poland, Romania, Ukraine, Latvia, Estonia, to exercise their historical grievances against Russia in a way they would not be able to do were it not for NATO. So this is an obsolete military alliance. Anyone with eyes to see with and a brain to think with understands that. The Cold War no longer exists except in the hearts and minds of this tiny clutch of neocon fanatics I mentioned, but it does not exist in the hearts and minds of the masses of the people, and certainly not the thousands of England fans who just returned from Russia in defiance of the campaign that was conducted to deter them from going to the World Cup, raving about the country, raving about its people, and the hospitality in which they received.
The game is kind of given away by the jitters that they're all expressing about the upcoming summit between Trump and Putin. Memorably, I think historically, immortalized in the Times front page, which said, "Fears grow over peace deal with Russia." Who on earth could be afraid of a peace deal?
Well, we've reached peak neocon with that kind of sentiment, because their whole ideological existence is depending on the demonization of Russia, with the depiction of Russia as a Soviet Union Mark II, an expansionist state, a state that has an agenda of domination of Eastern Europe, a state that means to disrupt Western Europe, is a threat to Western Europe, and it's none of those things. Russia has legitimate security interests that have been imperiled by the Western Bloc, using NATO not as a shield but as a sword. And what NATO also does, George, it cements this malign worldview within these neocon fanatics. You occupy prominent places in the media and the political class because it has allowed them to relegate diplomacy to the bottom of the toolbox when it comes to dealing with international issues and disagreements, and elevating militarism underpinned by might is right to the top of the toolbox. And when you consider who our allies are in Eastern Europe, and this is an important point, we're talking Ukraine, I just mentioned Poland, Romania, Latvia, Estonia. In Poland, the government earlier this year made it illegal for anyone to cite Polish complicity in the Holocaust, which did exist. In Ukraine, we have an Azov battalion, a key component of the country's national official militia, whose volunteers wear on their tunics, I kid you not, SS insignia. We're talking Latvia and Estonia, where every year since they escaped the quote-unquote clutches of the Soviet Union, there are annual commemorations to honour the role of Latvian and Estonian volunteers in SS battalions during the Second World War. They are our allies. And it's unconscionable to me that no one is understanding what we're involved with. We're helping to legitimize these fascist nostrums, which have made a comeback in that part of the world since the demise of the Soviet Union. And Russia, which, as you rightly constantly cite, played the indispensable role in destroying fascism in Europe and in ending the Holocaust in the 1940s.
Powerful reminders there. John White, thanks for joining us on the mother of all talk shows. John White, the author, writer, journalist and commentator. Sean Caden down in Australia says, shame Owen Jones and Khan's blimp flyers didn't show the same outrage when Israel put Palestinian kids in cages. Let me just comment on that also. It is not true that London Mayor Sadiq Khan is in any way responsible for Islamist terrorism in the world or in Britain. Neither is it true that the murder wave and crime wave is primarily the responsibility of Sadiq Khan. It is, as Khan says, more than a coincidence that the only mayor of any city where terrorism and crime is rampant who's ever attacked by Donald Trump is the brown guy, the guy with the Muslim name, Sadiq Khan. All of that is true. But I don't hate Sadiq Khan because he's brown or because he's Muslim. I don't condemn his miserable performance as the mayor of London, who might as well not be there when it's all flying, but who can find the time to fly a big rubber blimp. It's not Islamophobia that makes me say that Sadiq Khan is in utter dereliction of his London-wide duty to be leading an all-London campaign for the restoration of the police cuts that have left us wide open to the murder wave and the ever-present danger of terrorism. It's not Islamophobia, still less racism, that makes me say, if people like Sadiq Khan had stood up against Tony Blair's wars, invasions and occupations instead of supporting them, we wouldn't have nearly as much terrorism in the world, or by extension in London, that we do. Yoo-hoo says, everyone, George Galloway's live on talk radio with the mother of all talk shows, the best show on the radio and the only place to hear the truth. Peter in Glasgow says, did that unmitigated upper-class clown Hitchens call the beautiful people and lands of Afghanistan a swamp? He is the one that should be drained from our swamp. I think he meant the war, to be fair, Peter, rather than the country. Big Al says, George, Peter Hitchens says many a true word. He says it how it is, just talks the facts, not biased towards anyone. Good interview, my friend. Thanks, Al. And Sheil says, why indeed would the Trumps bow to the Queen? President Mary McAleese didn't when the Queen visited Ireland. It's not compulsory, you know. It's a personal choice. Get over it. The Queen even accepts this. And Andrew says, dear George, Theresa May in today's press conference said Donald and me when it should be Donald Trump and I. Do powerful men make her forget herself? Andrew, that's pedantry. Gadji says, heard Emily Thornberry suggesting Mrs. May should have a go at Trump for interfering in our business. Where were these voices when Obama told us to stay in the EU? Quite so. And when did Emily Thornberry tell the Israeli ambassador and his staff, her friends in the Labour Friends of Israel, that they should stop interfering in our business and plotting to, and I quote, bring down our ministers? Maurice Morgan says, I agree about now not bowing or curtsying to the Queen. I don't think anyone should these days. What's wrong with just a polite handshake when meeting her? Marie says, how could Gorbachev liken the United States of Europe as the USSR in the West. The EU has Nazi origins. Rodney Atkinson is on record as proving this in both Houses of Parliament in 2010, updated in 2014, where he names names. And Tony says, I heard a protester say, no, I think we've already read that one. Kassif says, Russia is a small power. Ask Napoleon if Russia is a small power. Ask Hitler if Russia was a small power. It's not a small power, and neither is Peter right about the size of its economy. It's the 6th biggest economy, and soon, according to the World Bank, will be the 5th biggest economy, and moreover, in its joined-at-the-hip alliance with the People's Republic of China, it is part of a duo that will, in the next 50 years, be the most powerful economic unit that the world has ever seen. And on the conventional battlefield, if they wanted to, the Russian army could be in Paris in just a few days, as any conventional theorist would tell you. And that would require Donald Trump, therefore, to fire nuclear weapons, which some of them are not all that confident that he would do. Christovsky says, I won't blow more smoke than has been blown already. Well done for having Hitchens on. Great start on Trump and NATO. Remind listeners you're global now. How many can say that in the UK? Regards from Hong Kong. Thanks, Christovsky. We are being listened to all over the world. That's true. And well, Adrian says, what is Hitchens talking about? 13 Russians have been indicted previously. 5 White House campaign staff have pleaded guilty. Today, 11 Russian GRU have been indicted. How is Russian scandal comparable to the birth certificate? Ludicrous. Well, no White House campaign staff have pleaded guilty to collusion with Russia in the election result. None. Precisely 0. And the Russians have been indicted precisely because they're in Russia and therefore will never have to be presented with evidence. Sorry, Adrian. Nice try. No cigar. The funniest man in England is Quentin Letts of the Daily Mail, a quite brilliant observer of the political scene. And I'm glad to say he joins us now. It's a Daily Mail night so far, Quentin. We had Peter Hitchens on earlier. We're being spoiled. Quentin, here's my point. Tell me if you agree. He may be a boor, an oaf. He may be a vulgarian. He may be trash. But what he said in his interview with Tom Newton-Dunn of The Sun had the benefit of being true. Mrs. May's Brexit is not what people voted for. It cannot prevail. It will not prevail. And if it prevailed, it would make independent trade deals with other countries, including his, impossible. Am I right?
I hate to say this, George, but I think you are. It's not often the case, it has to be said, that Galloway is right. But I think on this narrow point, yes, maybe you might be. And I have to deny all that stuff you were saying earlier about me being funniest man in England, rubbish. But I thought today could have gone worse for Mrs. May. Mr. Trump was a little bit more conciliatory at the press conference that was held at Chequers today. But that stuff in The Sun this morning did have the awful benefit of being true, because you can either have a Britain that isn't constrained by Europe, or if you're going to be in the European thing, then you can't do free trade deals with the rest of the world. And the Europhiles who are working for Mrs. May at number 10 Downing Street don't seem to understand that, or at least perhaps I'm sure they do understand it, but they're not prepared to be honest about that. And what his article, what the interview today in The Sun, a heck of a scoop by The Sun, did this morning was to lay bare the truth. You either got to choose between the EU or the rest, and the rest of the world. And that's what the Donald did. But today, in the Chequers press conference, he was a little bit more polite, but he was still saying, look, we've got to be able to do free trade.
Now, the opinion polling that I've seen, you must have, over the last 24, 48 hours, shows that the great majority of the British people agree with Trump that this is not the Brexit that people voted for, and that includes people who voted against Brexit. They can see. The Tory MPs, by the score, I would have thought, who will not vote for that. make the Chequers agreement null and void, don't they? Unless enough of the Blairite New Labour types are prepared to cross the floor and prop up the Tory government and get it through the House in that way. But that too would have consequences, wouldn't it?
I don't think there are enough of those Blairites to counterbalance the number of Tories who simply won't support this thing. The reason that Tory MPs are drifting away from Mrs May, as they are at the moment, like wildebeest running away from a lion, is that their activists, their Tory activists, are furious with Mrs May. Tory activists are, on the whole, pretty sheep-like. On the whole, they're pretty obedient. On the whole, they don't rebel against their party leadership, certainly not against the Prime Minister. But at the moment, they now, and I'm not overstating things here, I think, they now hate Mrs May. They really are viscerally opposed to her. So that's the reason you're seeing Tory MPs who are getting it in the ear and also in the emails from their activists. This is the reason that Tory MPs are running away from Mrs May. Now, that means that the Chequers Agreement at the moment, yes, is a non-starter. However, as a result of Mr. Trump's slightly more conciliatory approach today, and as a result of the pressure from Tory MPs, I think that any sensible person at 10 Downing Street will be thinking, yikes, we've overplayed our hand. We've pushed things too far. I think they've probably pushed it too far by about 15 or 20%. And if they now start making concessions to the Brexiteers, to the people who voted in the EU referendum in 2016, if they start making a few concessions, I think they might yet just about to be able to retrieve the situation. But it is amazing the way that Downing Street completely jumped the wrong way. It was like seeing a goat standing next to a motorway. It can either jump to safety or it could jump straight into the traffic. They jumped straight into the traffic. They jumped completely the wrong way by going towards Europe, and they are now reaping the consequences of that.
Now, the more concessions that they make, though, to Tory activists, Tory MPs, the less likely the European Union bureaucracy is to accept the proposal. So where does that take us?
Well, I don't know. I think actually the European Commission will be looking at Mrs May's position and thinking, God, we've pushed her too far. She's going to be toppled. I think she will be toppled unless she concedes quite a lot of ground to the Eurosceptics. And they'll be thinking, yikes, if Mrs May gets toppled, then that rotter Boris Johnson might become Prime Minister. And he would cane us the way that Trump would cane us. I mean, a lot of people, I think a lot of Brexiteers, a lot of Leave voters, and actually quite a few Remain voters, will look at Donald Trump and think, just as you said in your introduction, they will think, the bloke is a vulgarian, he's ghastly, he's a sort of brash billionaire, but he doesn't half know how to negotiate. He sees off, he creates sort of he throws a terrible stink bomb, and then as a result of that, people have to change their position. And there are a lot of people, I think, in this country who think that Trump would be handling the Brexit negotiations a lot more successfully than Mrs May has been. Now, the European Commission will be thinking, May is our best bet in this. We don't want to topple her, so maybe we need to give her some ground.
But surely, Quentin, if they thought like that over in Brussels, they wouldn't have struck the final position with David Cameron in the way that they did. Because if they'd been more flexible with Cameron, they might well have secured a victory for Remain in the referendum.
Indeed, George, but will they not have learned? Will they not have learned a little bit from that? Well, maybe they won't. Maybe they are so stupid that they won't have learned from that. But surely they can't be that Dummkopfian. And I suspect that they will be watching events very closely.
I don't know. Juncker looked a bit Dimcoxian to me on the steps the other day.
He looked almost as bad as Alex Salmond. Yes, he was not looking in a great state yesterday, but I don't think he's really the decision maker. I think the real decision makers are the heads of government, particularly of France and Germany. And the head of government of Germany will be thinking, the last thing Angela Merkel wants, is Boris Johnson being Prime Minister of Britain, because I think she's had a flavour in recent days of what it's like to be lashed by Donald Trump, and I don't suppose she's enjoyed it.
And finally, what timescale are we operating on here? When will the size of the Tory rebellion against Chequers become clear?
I haven't a clue, George. It's very, very hard to say, and I think it's changing by the hour. I think today's events have made Mrs. May a little bit safer, because I think were Trump to have come out and gone tonto at that press conference today, I think she'd have really been in enormous difficulties. I suspect they will probably be thinking, we want to have a summer holiday. I suspect also, mind you, that things will get really tricky for her at the Tory party conference in late September. I don't know. Nobody knows. She certainly doesn't know. Boris doesn't know. I don't think Boris really wants to go for things at the moment. So nobody knows Tiddly-Pom, but it ain't half...
ain't half hot, Mum.
It ain't half a turbulent sea.
Quentin Letts, not the funniest man in England. Thanks for joining us on the mother of all talk shows, the great Bruce Springsteen. Now, a miracle was what Quentin Letts seemed to, if not anticipate, at least hold out the possibility of a glimpse. And you'll notice a slight lack of sure-footedness on the part of right-wing pundits like Peter Hitchens and Quentin Letts, who at least came on the show. Peter Oborne wasn't available this evening to comment on his spiffing and brilliant Prime Minister Theresa May and hailing the victory of Chequers. And you'll remember that Dan, the Corbyn man, last week said that there would be no resignations. And of course, with Dan's track record, we should have known that there would be 2 resignations and then more in very quick succession. But these are not the only stories that are out there. Almost unnoticed, everything seems to be turning down, going south in North Korea, if you'll forgive the pun. Federico Solfrini is the research analyst at the University of St Andrews, international relations and North Korean foreign policy expert. Federico, thanks for joining us. Tell us what happened when the North Koreans just simply stood the Americans up.
Well, we have to understand the situation of North Korean leadership, because we must not be surprised of what happened yesterday, because it's a usual strategy of North Korean leadership, because they basically raise the tension in the peninsula, and then they will reach the possibility to organize meetings and high-level meetings, but then often they have withdrawn also during the past leadership. So it's just, I think, a way for North Korea to muddling through. That was a definition that Marcus Nolan gave about the country back in the 1997.
Muddling through. Yeah, but I mean, all these Singapore hopes where everything was being declared as a triumph, and Kim Jong-un was going to visit the White House and so on. That's suddenly ebbed away a bit, hasn't it?
Yeah, it is, but there are basically 2 security definitions at stake and 2 different ways to define the denuclearization policies. For the U.S., denuclearizing North Korea would mean basically weaken the regime and try to open the country in order to topple possibly the socialist regime in North Korea. But at the end, Kim Jong-un, of course, he knows that in order for him to survive, we have to remember that he's part of a dynastic family. It's not legitimized by the people, but it's just been a dictatorial regime that has been legitimized through corruption, through the ideologization of the people. And for him to survive, for sure, opening the socialist regime and dismantle his nuclear capabilities would mean basically the end of his dynasty and the end of his regime.
Of course, there are a lot of these dynastic regimes in the world. Some of them are our best friends, like Saudi Arabia, for example. They called the country after themselves. At least Kim Jong-un's grandfather didn't call Korea after himself and his family. But lastly, how has it gone down in the United States? I get the impression that the liberal and neocon coalition have managed sufficiently to trash Trump's quote-unquote achievement in Singapore that Trump may be trying, as it were, to forget that it ever happened.
Yeah, exactly. Because I think it's also this situation is also important for the U.S. internal situation. And for example, the fact that Trump is not remembering the Singapore summit means for sure that he's aware that he was not prepared, as he admitted lately, and also Pompeo is in troubles because in dealing with this situation, he had Donald Trump that is really an emotive man, and his attitude in Singapore has been really full of pride. But at the end, he admitted that nothing happened. Really, they didn't establish any timetables, and so now I think he's changing the main topics of his speeches in order to not remember for sure that nothing happened.
Before long, Federico, he'll be describing it as fake news.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Federico Solfrini, who is University of St Andrews expert on North Korea. The Communicapolist says further to the sad death of Dawn Sturgis, the mainstream media is saying Novichok killed her. Her post-mortem will take place next Tuesday, before an inquest into her death opens on Thursday next week. So they have no idea what the cause of death was. All propaganda. Well, it's a mystery, this whole tale, isn't it? Turns out the Novichok was in a bottle. In the beginning, it was a gel, but before that, it was powder that had been put in the air vents in the car. Before that, it was in flowers that had been taken to the graveyard of Julia Skripal's mother, Mr. Skripal's late wife. Before that, it was in Julia's luggage that she'd inadvertently brought through customs in Moscow and in London. Before that, or rather after that, it was a syringe, and then it was a vial, and then it was a tub, and now it's a bottle. Was it a vodka bottle? Does anyone know what kind of bottle it was? The ultimate would be if it was a vodka bottle made in the USSR. Now, let's take the first call of the evening, shall we, from Syra in Taunton in Somerset. Syra, welcome to the show.
Hello.
Hi.
It's very nice to talk to you.
And you, madam.
I do actually agree with Donald Trump about what he said about this Brexit deal.
Mm-hmm.
I think that the whole thing's been absolutely abysmal from the beginning because of the concerted efforts of just about every vested interest to sabotage it, and it has been total sabotage. But over and above that, I think what's really dangerous is it's further undermined an already undermined system of institutions that took centuries to accumulate. And once they've gone, and once people have lost total trust in them, then what you're going to be left with is pretty unpalatable as a place to live. And I think that the principles, or lack of them, have underpinned the entire process, and the fact that two British Prime Ministers in succession have fundamentally lied to the people.
A lot more than two, Sarah.
I mean, just sticking to Brexit itself, I know It's 40 years of it, basically, but I'm thinking in terms of Cameron when he promised the referendum would be decided by the people, because actually Parliament couldn't decide it. Mm-hmm. The divisions were clearly acknowledged and known then.
Correct.
And then this absolute shambles of Theresa May and the mad way she was elected, then pretending, stringing people along, basically. Whether it was by design or whether it was complete mishandling I suppose it is important to know, but the cumulative effect of it all is utterly depressing and will create enormous, disturbance in society, which is already fairly disturbed as it is.
Maybe it needed disturbing, though, Syra. I mean, I don't have the faith in these institutions that you do, so I can't mourn the passing of them in the way that you evidently do. I sat in Parliament for almost 30 years. I've now sat outside of it for 3. And for me, it's unfit for purpose. Our Parliament, with an unelected upper chamber, under an unelected Ruritarian-style monarchy, with an unfair voting system that allows parties that get millions of votes to get no MPs, that allows parties that get only just a little more votes than the other to get huge parliamentary majorities, that doesn't allow the public in between elections, 5 years at a time now, officially and legally, with no direct democracy being permitted. I think that our democracy is unfit for purpose. But I agree with you, its unfitness is being demonstrated hourly over this whole Brexit affair.
I agree with you completely. I actually think that myself, essentially. But the way that this is being done, I think, is also extremely dangerous.
It is dangerous because, and it would. But I'll tell you the one saving grace or the silver lining in this cloud, Syra. The polling has taken a dramatic turn, and I follow these things very closely. The polling amongst people on, for example, the Chequers deal, only something like 13% of the British public, 13, think that Theresa May's Brexit deal thrashed out at Chequers was satisfactory. The number of people who think it a betrayal of what people voted for outpolls those who think it was a good deal by 4, 5, 6 to 1. The settled will of the British public, whatever way they voted 2 years ago, is that Britain should get out of this European Union as quickly as possible.
Absolutely. And I think what's really alarming is whatever the deficiencies of this system that we live in, when you look across at the EU, it pales into comparison.
Absolutely.
The EU
Absolutely. At least we can remove our governments. Nobody can remove
terrifying.
the drunkard junker.
Exactly.
Nobody can remove him.
No, I think the spectre of what Europe could become. I mean, I have absolutely no understanding of why people would support it for that very
Especially
reason.
people on the left and people who call themselves progressive. Sarah, it's been a pleasure talking to you. Thanks very much indeed for ringing. Mibby Galloway is right. Let's hae a bloody, arterial, syphilitic, commie nutter like Stalin running the whelk stall and see if his record can be beat. Jockey Brune. That's Jockey Brune pretending to be Scottish. You see, you can't kid a kidder, Jockey, and you can't kid a Scotsman that you are a Scotsman. And another anonymous hater says, George, you're a fake news master. I'll take that as a compliment. And Jockey Brune again, has that wee man been to his beloved Cuba yet? Whar the locals use local currency to buy survival basics and watch the tourists gieing it big wi' real dosh. Whit a plonker. Jockey Brune, I think we've heard enough of your idiocies. Tony X says, Peter Hitchens is the only man in the world whose plummy accent isn't despicable to me, because what he says overrides it. And Bob Justice says, how many times have we been here waiting for the scandal-riddled Maytastrophe to leave number 10? A Russian bot may say this is unbelievable. Has she claimed squatters' rights, or are Chuka and Jess standing guard on Downing Street like Pavlov's neoliberal dogs. Brilliantly said. He's back again, this Jockey Brune. It's that wee bochel fae lochie gieing us his great thoughts again. Thanks a bucket. Away you back hame to your ain bit, wee man. It's funny, Jockey Brune hates me so much that he's listening avidly to the show and spending 25 pence plus normal sending charges by the bucket load to convey his thoughts on my thoughts. Couldn't make it up, really. Sean is in Waterloo. My goodness, what a place to be, Sean. Hey,
thank you, George.
Tell me, what do you think?
George, first of all, I just wanted to give a little paean of praise to you. I've been following you for many years now and never got a chance to speak to you. So I just wanted to say that you're not only a hero of our time, but you've earned your noble place in history for your tenacious pursuit of the truth. Anyway, I know you're a modest man. You wouldn't want me to go on about that.
No.
Get on with my point.
No, I'm very grateful, though.
You're welcome. So, yes, the point I wanted to make was that I think that the demonstrators today are making a mistake, and let me explain why. The fact that Novichok 2 has suddenly been reheated today, and Mueller has made these indictments against these Russians, indicates to me that it's the military-industrial complex that is really the main driver behind this whole Russophobic narrative.
Now, you're right. Absolutely correct.
When we talk about the military-industrial complex, we're talking about people who have world-destroying weapons. For them to reveal their hand, and they are revealing their hand by doing this today, that means they're frantic. So we've got frantic people with world-destroying weapons. That makes me very, very afraid. And I suppose what the point I'm trying to make is, yes, of course, Trump is a boorish, ignorant demagogue. But when the issue is this military-industrial complex with these kind of people in control of it, who obviously want those demonstrators to be on the street. I mean, those demonstrators, they have the best of intentions, but they're exactly where these people want them to be because they still want to impeach Trump, because their ultimate ambition is to stop the summit with Putin, because they want to protect their power and their control. And for that reason, I think the bigger geopolitical issues outweigh the moral abhorrence that these people feel for Trump's statements.
Well, I agree with every word that you said, and I'd only add this. It's true, undoubtedly, that Trump is a vulgar misogynist who looks upon women as meat. Bill Clinton, anyone, the well-known saxophonist, saxophonist, I said.
Yes.
Bill Clinton, anyone. A lot of these people that were leading that march today would have fallen at the feet of Bill Clinton. Was he less of a misogynist than Donald Trump? Or others who rightly abhor Trump's willingness to fire off rockets and bombs? But Barack Obama let off more bombs, fired more rockets, killed more people with more drones than Donald Trump has. Or those who abhor, and rightly so, his policy of separating children from their parents at the border. But Obama did more of that. He deported more people. Bill Clinton sent more black people to prison than the racist Donald Trump sent to prison, or ever could. Bill Clinton sent a small nation of black prisoners into jail. 3 strikes and you're out, and you're in forever. And the hypocrisy of the leaders of that march has no bottom. That's not a criticism of the huge numbers who went on the demonstration, most of whom, the great majority of whom, were on it for the best of reasons. Absolutely. But it's our duty, and that's what you and I in this conversation are trying to do, to sketch the big picture, the real reasons, The real reason why the NATO top brass hate Trump is not because he grabs pussy, but because he might not be as prepared as previous American presidents to unlimitedly support and sponsor their military-industrial project. Am I right?
Absolutely. And well, my feeling is that those people on the marches are being manipulated. I know most of them have good intentions, but in the context of the world today, they are being manipulated. And I'd just like to make another point, remind people that sometimes history works through very strange instruments. Ronald Reagan was one of the biggest Cold War crusaders that they ever had in the presidency, but he's the one, with Mikhail Gorbachev, who ended the Cold War. So we need to think in a wider context about these things.
Sean in Waterloo, been a pleasure talking to you. The helpful troll says, you have to be honest, George, the blimp is a bit of a damp squib. We were expecting a Zeppelin style and size, and instead we get to see a cheap, tiny balloon miles from Parliament and 15 foot off the ground in a deep pit, so it can't be seen from the road. And Rob Kearney says, thanks, George, for introducing John White, a journalist who I will look forward to following in the future. Quite right, Rob, first-class writer. Patrick is a first-class novelist, by the way, undervalued novelist. You should buy one or two and you'll see I'm right. Patrick Vidine says, they don't half tell some porkies. Novichok found in a small bottle in Charlie Rowley's house. That's it then. Amesbury poisoning solved after all, no doubt found in some bushes by Charlie and Dawn, and they thought they'd experiment. Yeah, sure. And Mark says, George, why do talk radio news feel it more important than their listeners hear the opinion of the former leader of the Labour Party rather than the current one? Do you know what, Mark? I was just thinking and saying exactly the same thing. Jeremy Corbyn got quite a welcome at that march, but we haven't heard a word of it. Instead, we've heard from Bacon Roll Man, Ed Miliband. And David Levsconte says, hi, Gigi, the EU reminds me of the Hotel California by the Eagles. You can check out any time you like, but you can never leave. Cassif says, George, Mrs. May has played a political masterstroke. She's thrown her lot in with the Remain Tory MPs, which make up 2/3 of Tory MPs, so she can win a leadership election, so they can then also avoid a general election, as the PM remained as leaders. I think you've got the numbers wrong there. Keith says, EU procurement is often worse than the public sector has been given a leg up under regulatory alignment fudge. And George, what happened to World War III? Did you get it wrong again? Well, watch this space, mate, and put your name on the end of your text next time. Peter says, I've said from the very beginning, North Korea has done its testing. It has its nukes. Why on earth would it give up its only ace, knowing that once it has no more nuclear weapons, it's an open target for whoever, especially when I keep on mentioning the Libya scenario. Libya, I think that is. If I was Kim, no way would I be giving up any of my nukes. Marie, finally, says, so ironic that the EU Commission is unelected but appointed by, who knows. They will meet in secret to discuss Brexit. This is one reason I voted to leave. It's an anti-democratic fortress run by banks and big business in secret. I love that song. What a fantastic number that is. Fantastic movie too. We're talking Trump, of course. We're talking Brexit and the imbroglio, the swamp into which Theresa May has now fallen. Some think she'll never get out of it. I'm one of those. Quentin Letts felt that she had a chance if she rose back from Chequers, 15 to 20%, he says. And then I say, well, the EU Commission might not even have been prepared to accept Chequers, let alone Chequers plus 15 to 20%. Quentin thinks that they may have learned something from the negotiations with David Cameron. I say, junkers to that. Let's hear from the legend that is Damien in Brighton. Go ahead, Damien.
Good evening, George.
Evening, sir.
George, I think that as well as demonstrating against Donald Trump, I think we also need to ask the question of how such a person became elected the President of the United States.
Yes, good point.
Now, I think there's a very straightforward answer to that question, George, but that answer does have some serious implications, which we might need to go into some detail on. Now, I believe that Donald Trump was elected because the Democratic Party selected a flawed, deeply unpopular candidate without any policies addressing the concerns of working people, instead of selecting Bernie Sanders, who was a highly popular candidate and who did have a very, very popular policy platform.
Quite so. And we've had that kind of problem here too, haven't we?
Precisely, George. There's really little doubt that Bernie Sanders' poll was polling consistently higher. I'd go further than that. Bernie Sanders was crushing Donald Trump in the polls, and he would have, on the evidence of the polling, he would have wiped Trump's clock in the presidential election. So, of course, that question leads to another question, doesn't it, George, is that why on earth would the Democrats rig their candidate selection to favour an obvious loser over an obvious winner?
Well, I think because they took the American electorate for granted, as New Labour did here. They worked on the assumption that the working class, the blue collar, the poor, could only vote for them, however far right they moved. But they failed to notice Trump coming up on the blind side, making noises, at least, aimed at the disinherited of the insultingly named Rust Belts of America.
Exactly, George. The fact of the matter was that the Democrats were outflanked from the left by Trump on many issues. Now, and I think this boils down, I think if we're going to get to the heart of the issue, I would say that the heart of the problem has been centrism in the Democrat Party and in New Labour. Now, the reason that the Democrats, I would argue, rigged the contest against Sanders was because he was offering free college education, universal health care, a $15 minimum wage, and interestingly, he held the same position on NATO as Trump, in that he was arguing in favour of reducing military spending. So he was butter, not bombs. And those policies were completely unacceptable to the donors who bankroll the Democratic Party. And so the issue in America was corruption of the political parties by big money donors. And I believe this can be traced back to Bill Clinton, George, who began copying Republican policies. He started employing the centrist electoral strategy, which obviously is a strategy that holds that voters coalesce around the centre. So the path to victory is to scoop votes up from the centre. But here's the flaw that's affected us in this country, because Clinton was introduced austerity, he introduced privatisation and deregulation of the banks. He got rid of Glass-Steagall in America. Now, what happened to New Labour, I believe, in this country was that Blair not only copied the centrist electoral strategy, but copied the policies as well.
Yeah.
And that was...
He did the same with our banks. We didn't have a Glass-Steagall, but he did effectively the same.
Exactly, and that was...
And boasted about it, that he had effectively deregulated the City of London, which then led to the crash.
Precisely. Now, George, this is where it gets interesting, because those policies, those neoliberal policies that were introduced by supposedly parties, the Democrats and the New Labour, who's supposed to represent the interests of working people, they've privatisation, deregulation and austerity have exponentially increased inequality, mortality rates, public and private debt, and they've destroyed public services. And I believe they're all also directly responsible for the rise of the far right in America, in the UK and in Europe. And I think that pursuing these policies has been deeply destabilising, not just domestically, but with international relations. And in my view, George, only a socialist government has the policies and the will to ratchet back those neoliberal policies.
My view too. Thanks very much, Damien, for that. Paul Booker says, I assume that the detectives who discovered the alleged bottle of Novichok at Charlie Rowley's house in Amesbury were wearing suitable protective clothing. If not, are we to expect more victims of this poisoning? When on earth will this story end? Denny says, Nick Clegg at an anti-Trump march sums it up. Odious creep. This is the only programme worth listening to. Keep relating truth to us. Thank you for that, Denny. Art Bennett says, regards from Melbourne, Gigi. Great to hear from John White, running Twitter in left screen, live talk radio in right screen. Way to go. Wow, isn't that wonderful from Melbourne? Thanks, Art. Jane says, message in a bottle. The police. Yeah, we should really play that when we leave this evening. Message in a bottle by the police. And a texter says, anonymous, George, I don't hate you. I love you! ! And this from Samson in Kilmarnock, one of our cleverest writers, says, evening, George, there are many reasons to protest against Trump, but I do hope that those who did not only also oppose Obama, but consider their reasons carefully. It isn't consistent to march against Trump's immigration policy when Obama deported more immigrants than any other US president. If troubled by Trump's rhetoric around women, surely we should be equally concerned about Obama bombing women in the Middle East. The message should not be that some crimes are permissible if you're suave and handsome, but detestable if your personality offends petty liberal sensibilities. Otherwise, protesters become pawns in the media narrative. As an example of this potential, the Scotsman reported that protesters opposed Trump's, quote, close ties to Russia, unquote. Samson, the NATO Trotskyite, Paul Mason of erstwhile of the BBC, he's daily saying exactly that. We should oppose Trump because of his close ties to Russia and his too limited enthusiasm for preparing for war with Russia. Well, you can march under that slogan if you like, but count me out. Fra says there's no real democracy, George. There's only majority rule or mob rule, depending on your definition. And with only the two main parties, both centrist at times, there is really no choice, Corbyn aside. Well, I don't think you can put Corbyn aside. Seventh Syndicate says, are our spooks sure that the bottle they found is Novichok? It could be the bottle that Theresa May lost to deliver the Brexit we voted for. And Lenny Godber says 3 weeks to find what put an alcoholic in hospital in a bottle in his gaff. Do me a favour. Recovering alcoholic, Godber. And this email from Peter says, it's sad because at one time I would have done anything for our government until I realised they're all liars, disingenuous, and have agendas which are not in the interests of our people, but the interests of large corporations and geopolitical destruction. I told you 2 weeks ago about Nord Stream 2 and that certain countries would do anything to demonize Russia and get Germany to pull out of the deal. Countries like the Ukraine, who have all the capabilities to carry out the Salisbury attack and, more importantly, a motive. This country has backed itself into a corner by accusing Russia with absolutely no evidence. It now has to find a way out. Good luck, says Peter. Well, Jeremy Corbyn was right, wasn't he? He was right when he demanded evidence of the nerve gas attack on Douma that never was, before we launch a blizzard of cruise missiles at a country already much bombed called Syria. He was right when he said we needed to present evidence before accusing Russia of the Skripal affair. And hasn't everything that has happened in Salisbury and in Amesbury, including today's news, vindicated the view expressed by Corbyn, by Hitchens, by Craig Murray, by myself, and very few others, that it's easy to make what could turn out to be false accusations, and the damage done by them will be very, very difficult to undo. James says, George, so Trump says we won't have a US deal with May's current Brexit plans. What a relief. Last time I heard they were planning to open the NHS to American markets. That's not what I voted for when I voted for Brexit. I voted to end the EU and its drive for privatisation, but not for the US to take its place. No single market and no Tory deals. Corbyn in now. My view entirely, indeed, I expressed exactly that, I hope, in my opening remarks. Tony X, the protest board, says there has been a hidden Cold War for decades, but nobody seems to have noticed. Now, with Trump's meanderings, it's coming into focus. The war between the UN and NATO, evidenced by the recent withdrawals from the UN. I stand firmly behind the UN, says Tony. Tony goes on, if we're not already agreed that the EU is a construct designed to strangle the ambitions of EU nations in favour of 2 or 3 countries, Germany, France and Belgium, we soon will be. And Mal in Belfast says, I can only dream of a day when Ireland leaves the EU and the North is united with the South and forms a trading bloc with England, Scotland and Wales, with the punt and the pound aligned, and a joint trading bloc assembly. And David Leviscont says if evidence comes about that clears Russia of any involvement in the Novichok poisonings, what will our government do? Will they eat humble pie? I suspect they'd rather eat Novichok. Mr. Harold, as they probably called you downstairs, at least, Grant, in the big houses that you worked in as the royal butler, I'm very grateful to you for coming on the show this evening. Welcome.
My pleasure. Good evening. Yes, you're absolutely right. It was actually Young Harold was my nickname.
Young Harold. And you probably would have kept that nickname for many years.
It. I worried when anybody called me Gran. I get very worried. It had to be Young Harold, and then I knew it was fine.
Now, listen, Grant, or Mr. or Young Harold. Let me ask you 2 protocol issues that people are much exercised about this evening.
Absolutely.
The first of which, in my opinion, has no validity at all, but the second of which may well do. The first is that Donald Trump nor his wife neither bowed nor curtsied when they met the Queen today. Your verdict, please.
I noticed that. I was paying attention, and of course, because being from the States, they don't need to bow a curtsy. It's a personal thing. If they wanted to, they could, but being from, as they're not British subjects, they didn't need to.
It wouldn't look good, would it? The leader of a country that fought the entire Revolutionary War to overthrow King George, to bow to his heirs and successors.
Well, I think the thing is, as you said, certain times it doesn't work, and I think this is an occasion where it obviously wasn't the done thing. Of course, certain leaders do, but it's a very personal thing. And as I said, I didn't really expect that they would. And if they did, lovely gesture, but of course it wouldn't be expected at all.
Not at home, and that's what these trips are all about for
Absolutely.
Trump. Now, the second complaint, I think, has some validity. I've just looked at the pictures. When he was walking with the Queen, he seemed to have no conception, A, that he is a veritable giant compared to her, with a much longer stride, and she's 93. And he then ended up, therefore, walking in front of her with her disappearing from view. This showed, at the very least, a lack of manners, didn't it?
Well, do you know, the clip you're talking about 20 minutes ago, I saw the very same clip. I missed this because I was actually at Windsor when this was all going on, and I just watched the clip 20 minutes ago, and it's quite amusing, but at the same time, as you said, the Queen suddenly disappears for a moment.
Yeah.
But what's wonderful is she then reappears, and she immediately kind of is guiding them as to what to do, which I love, because that's exactly what the Queen's like. She's keeping everybody right and telling them what to do.
Well, she's been doing this sort of thing for a long time.
Exactly. I mean, I've always been very lucky to have looked after and worked for her, and she's very good with this kind of thing. When it comes to making people feel at ease, making them feel at home, keeping them right. It's, as you said, she's been doing it for quite a few years now.
She has, but she'll not have dealt with many brutes like Donald Trump before. Do you think she viewed it all with a certain trepidation, given his reputation?
I don't think so. I only say if we're talking about a young, let's just say we're talking about a young monarch, possibly. But I think because she's been there, did it, done it, got the T-shirt. I think it's her 12th president.
Her Majesty would never wear a T-shirt, young
No,
Harold.
That's true. I think if she did, I think even I would be reaching for the smelling salts.
Exactly. So you reckon that she took it all in her stride?
I think she did. The only other thing that people have kind of mentioned to me that I think that she had been kept waiting when the president arrived, but I was under the impression he was due to arrive at 5, and he arrived 5 on the dot. So I think again she just wanted to kind of make sure everything was perfect, and I can understand why. I think if you've got somebody coming to your humble home, you want everything to be just right.
Now, I didn't see the Duke of Edinburgh anywhere on view. Is he poorly?
No, not at all. Well, not as far as I'm aware. No, not at all. I think it's the fact that he's gone into this retirement, which is quite. I mean, I can understand why, but at the same time, it's quite sad because I noticed that obviously there was a member of the household walking with the Queen, which is obviously what the Duke would be doing, and so it's quite a sad to kind of see that. But I think it's just as simple as that he's retired.
I just think it would have been magical, you see, with both of their diplomatic qualities, and a microphone picking up the chat. One can only wonder what they might have said to each other.
Could you imagine? I think probably it was probably better maybe that there wasn't any microphone around when he was there. I think it'd be safer.
Yeah, possibly. Now, it's all been and gone. He didn't get an invite to the royal wedding. Do you think he would be smarting over that?
No, not at all. I think. I mean, the reality is, I was lucky enough to have gone. I didn't go into the church, but I was outside, and I think the reality was there's only so many people you can invite, and it wasn't. I think if it had been a bigger affair, if it had been like Prince William's wedding, then that's a very different kind of case. But for this, obviously, the world leaders went invited, so I don't think so. I hope not.
But because Meghan was nowhere to be found either, and people say that her political stripe is not exactly his.
I think the thing is, I noticed obviously that the only member of the royal family that he obviously met was the Queen. And again, it's not unusual. I mean, there has been world leaders that have come over and, as you said, normally the Duke of Edinburgh and the Queen, but they don't always get to meet them. But I think the other thing with with the royal family and with the new Duchess of Sussex is when it comes to politics and that kind of thing, they're technically supposed to kind of not kind of get involved, if that makes sense. They're supposed to kind of. So I think the reality was that they obviously felt that on this occasion it was best for him to meet the Queen, and that was it. But who knows if there's another visit or possibly a state visit? I mean, obviously he's still got a few years to go.
Well, he hopes he's got a few years to go. He might not.
Yes, that's true.
Now, you're a Scotsman, young Harold.
I am.
Tell us.
You're a fellow Scot.
Yeah, where are you from in Scotland?
Originally from a place called Airdrie, which I'm sure you know.
I know Airdrie very well. Yes, I usually drive through it quite quickly, given my given being a Celtic supporter. It's probably wise. I'm better off in Cope Bridge than I am in Airdrie. But
I've still got family friends up there, so I've kept promising I will go back, but I haven't been that way for quite a few years now.
Make sure it's open when you go. Now, how did you end up as the royal butler?
It was, for me, it was a kind of dream come true, if I can say that. I was actually saying to some clients today that when I was a youngster, I had two ambitions in life. One was to go into drama, and the other was to work for the royal family or marry into the royal family, as my father told me. And of course, marrying into it was kind of ruled out, which isn't impossible these days, but of course it was ruled out. And I eventually got a job working at an estate in Scotland. Did that for a couple of years, and then I moved on to Woburn Abbey. That's when I moved down south. worked for the Dukes of Bedford, 2 dukes, obviously in succession, and then I heard that the Prince was looking for a butler and went to work for him and the rest of the family. And but it was amazing because, as I said, as a youngster, it was my, as daft as it might sound, it was a kind of dream, a kind of ambition. And the acting side, I was lucky enough to be in a television series called Country House soon after going to work at Woburn Abbey, and in recent years I've carried on doing television work. So I do feel very kind of lucky, and I even say to youngsters when I get the opportunity to go around schools and say to them, if you've got a dream or ambition, no matter how crazy people tell you that it is, because I was told the whole way along it was crazy, stick to it, and whatever that might be, you can make it come true. And I suppose that's kind of what I've done. And then more recently, what I kind of now do is I've kind of moved away from the butler, and I'm more kind of teaching people how to kind of behave around royals and dignitaries and VIPs through etiquette, British etiquette, and I train butlers over at Blenheim Palace. So this kind of AK Royal Butler has stuck with me. So, but I love what I do. I mean,
not bad for a boy from Airdrie, I must say.
I know who to paper round. That's the other thing. When I was 13, I remember delivering the papers, thinking one day I'm going to do better than just delivering papers.
Lastly, as I said earlier, and I really did watch Downton Abbey again last night.
I love Downton Abbey.
Mr. Carson has to be the acme of butlers.
He is. I look up to Mr. Carson. When anything ever goes wrong, or somebody says anything to me, or if there's a question I can never answer, I will say, "Oh, what would Mr. Carson say?" He'd be horrified. I love Downton Abbey, and funny enough, one of the advisors, Alistair Bruce, I was with him today, and I'm sure as everybody's kind of heard.
Well, they've just announced the movie.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's very exciting times. So, and I'm now encouraging anybody out there who wants to be a butler, they've got to come along to Blenheim Palace this is a bit of advertising for my butler school.
Butler school at Blenheim Palace. Well, I'll not be there myself, young Harold, because I'm too long in the tooth now.
Well, you're always welcome to come along and have a look.
Thank you very much indeed for coming on the show. Young Harold, that is. Grant Harold, the former royal butler. Message in a bottle. Well, what kind of bottle? That's what I want to know next. Was it Kremlin vodka or iron brew? Was it plastic? Was it glass? How long had it been there? How did it get there? These are the questions we need answering. Now, just a point in parenthesis. A little bird told me that I'm Robin Finlay was going to be reading the traffic news on the show this evening. But she hasn't. That's another of life's mysteries. Since the day and hour I interviewed I'm Robin Finlay, she has never been heard on the show again. I blame the deep state myself. Let's hear from Kevin in Glasgow. Go ahead, Kevin.
Hey, George, good evening.
Evening, sir.
First time caller, long time listener.
Okay.
I've spoke to you a couple of times on your personal mobile number, but there's been I'm in the Gorbals, I think.
Oh yes, Kevin, yes. The Gorbals always in my heart.
Yeah. It's just something I've been dying to ask you. Now, it's a wee bit off topic for tonight's stuff, but it's been something you've been talking about for a long time. I'm puzzled. When there was talk about Jacob Rees-Mogg being the next head of the Conservative Party, well, how could that be if, like, given his religion? I thought that was like written in stone that was a
no. It's a long-held myth. There never actually has been a Roman Catholic Prime Minister, but there's no law at all that says you can't be. Tony Blair waited until he was the ex-Prime Minister before joining the Catholic Church, but that was his call, not anything to do with the British Constitution. A bigger problem for Jacob Rees-Mogg is that he'd be more pertinent as a candidate in Downton Abbey or in an early episode of The Crown with his double-breasted silk pyjamas and his smoking hat and all of that. No, the next leader of the Conservative Party, as sure as eggs is Boris Johnson. So strap yourself in for that, Kev.
Oh, I thought we'd get rid of him, but...
No. Just when you thought it was safe to get back in the water. He's back. Give my regards to the Gorbals, Kevin, and thanks for the call. Paul in Manchester's up next. Go ahead, Paul.
Hello, good evening, George.
Good evening, sir.
Nice to hear from you again. We've not spoken for a few weeks.
No, that's right.
How have you been keeping, sir?
By the grace of God, I'm tip-top in fighting form.
Wonderful, wonderful. Yes, could I talk about Donald Trump's visit, please?
Yes, please do, yes.
First of all, sir, I'll make no bones about it. I don't like the guy. I don't like what he stands for, his racist attitudes and all that. But the other thing is, I mean, how much is it going to cost the taxpayers?
Quite a lot, yeah, quite a lot. But if he wanted to come, there wasn't much that the British government could do about it. They could hardly tell the President of the United States that he wasn't welcome, not given our history and our common interests and the common language that divides us. It would have been a tricky one for the British to put him off. Indeed, I think they did put him off for a time, but it got a bit embarrassing when he wasn't at the royal wedding and all of that. So he wanted to come, and he's now golfing, or will be in the morning, at his own golf course in Scotland.
Yeah, the same geezer who dodged the column with Vietnam on the basis of bad ankles, yet you've got to have good ankles to swing a club.
Well, he's never off the golf course, so his ankles have had that miraculous recovery. You could call it the Ernest Saunders effect. You remember Mr. Saunders was suffering from Alzheimer's, which rapidly went into reverse when all the criminal charges over the Guinness fraud trial were withdrawn.
Yeah, but, I mean, my main concern is the cost to the taxpayer, because we're all cash-strapped, the cost to the taxpayer. And, it smacks of, like, the MP's expenses. You didn't claim a penny piece, not a scatter cushion, but there were some people claiming for duck ponds and all sorts. It just gets a bit tiresome that poor old taxpayer's got to foot the bill,
Yeah, of course, but that happens with any state visit. I mean, we had that the buccaneering new Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia here just the other week, and we've had a parade of tyrants over the years. And if they make state visits here, we've got to pay for it. And if we make state visits there, they've got to pay for it. It's just the way of the world, I think, Paul.
Yeah, it's the unacceptable face of capitalism.
Yes, as someone once said. Paul, great to hear from you again. I'm snowed under, so I need to press on. Chris is in Colchester. Go ahead, Chris.
Hi, George.
Hi.
Yeah, I mean, just to see, I like Damien, but he's wrong about Bernie Sanders.
Tell me.
I know he's a socialist, and I think that's the reason that he was stopped, because of his domestic policies.
Yeah.
But his foreign policy is virtually identical to Hillary Clinton. He's voted the same as her.
He opposed the war, didn't he?
Pardon?
He opposed the Iraq war.
He opposed the war in Iraq only because it was the Republicans doing it, but he voted to finance the war afterwards, many times afterwards. He voted for the sanctions on Iraq that killed 500,000 children. He voted to give 1.5 trillion to Lockheed Martin. He voted from every war, basically, apart from the Iraq war, from Kosovo to Yemen. And he had some hysterical fit at some pro-Palestinian person that was talking about the bombing in Gaza, and he started spewing this Israeli propaganda about Hamas. So you just got to look at his record, and I know people want politicians to be what they want them to be, but if you look at their record and what they do, same with Obama before the 2008 election, then you would have seen that he was a fraud, which he turned out to be. He was one of the people as a senator that helped put sanctions on Iran. So, you just have to look at what people do rather than what they say.
No, a fair point. Absolutely, Chris. I think the point Damien made was that he was not in favour of the vast expansion that Trump is presiding over in U.S. military expenditure. The U.S. is now spending more than the next 10 countries combined.
Yeah, that's the thing with Trump. He was, and this is the reason why the neolib and the neocons are against him, because of what he said about Syria. And this is why they hate Putin as well, because Russia changed the game in Syria. Hillary Clinton was talking about the moderate rebels, and she wanted to fund them.
We would have been in full-scale war in Syria if Hillary Clinton had become the president. The U.S. would have invaded Syria if she had become president. And some of the Egypts that were leading the march today would have been throwing rose petals in her path on her state visit to Britain.
Exactly, and that could have led to direct war with Russia. And the trouble with these protesters, they don't know this information. And I believe if they knew what people like me and you knew, that they wouldn't be protesting Donald Trump. Some of them would maybe, but they would be protesting every US president. Yeah. Just what the previous administrations have done in South America, in the Middle East, in Southeast Asia. You know, the list is continuous.
It is. Well, that's why we need to get more people tuning in to the Open University of the Airwaves. Chris in Colchester, thanks for that call. John Flood. My goodness, I've got relatives called Flood. John Flood says, those who vote Labour support a racist and terrorist. Hashtag end of. Oh dear, oh dear. Dr. Fath URS says, George, after watching the US President's state visit, it would appear that once again Theresa May is quite literally clinging to the tassels of an orange sash. And Hedy says, Novichok obfuscation. Sherlock Holmes had a case where on the night in question the dog should have barked, but it didn't, proving, as he said, quote, that what is not there is often as important as what is. Do you hear much barking? I don't. I hear fake meows. And Claire Jarvis says, George, presumably the government will have to write another large cheque for Charlie Rowley's courtyard house and all those attached to it before they are demolished. I'm very interested in Charlie Rowley's house. He is, and we pray for his salvation, he is an unemployed daily methadone user at Boots the Chemist in Salisbury. In 2015, he was sent to prison for dealing heroin in the city. He has no visible means of support, but somehow he lives in a house worth nearly £300,000. I want to know more, and if we had a decent media, I'd already know more about Charlie Rowley and his courtyard house. Tony X says Damien has it right, but neglects to mention Hillary's appalling record in her positions as both cuckolded First Lady and then as Obama's Secretary of State, overseeing the filthy green lighting of the war on Yemen by the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. That's from his album The Rising, which I think is the greatest of all Springsteen albums. Try and listen. John in Camden in London is on the line. He's always worth hearing. John, welcome back.
Good evening, George.
Good evening, sir.
I just want to bring to your attention, you probably know more about this than I do. We are now entering the 7th successive night of rioting on the Bogside in Derry in protest of the intimidation from the Apprentice Boys March. In East Belfast, Police Service of Northern Ireland officers were fired on with automatic weapons by loyalist paramilitaries from the removal of some bonfire stacks. There have been loyalist bombs in Catholic areas throughout the province. Is there something going on here that we don't know about? And there have been also petrol bomb attacks in the Bogside on innocent civilians by mainly thugs, but stirred up by dissident Republican groups. Have you got any kind of idea or thought on what's going on here, mate?
Well, I do, but no thanks to the mainstream media here, which has largely ignored the fact that acts of war are taking place on the streets of 6 counties in which Britain claims jurisdiction. In other words, from the British point of view, this is happening in our own country. And acts of war and barbarism are taking place. The one thing you didn't mention there, but I should, is the attacks on refugee communities in East Belfast. Romanian families, for example, being burned out and driven out of their homes, presumably because Romanian sounds to some of them like Rome. It is a deeply shocking, disturbing, annual nightmare that the people in the 6 counties have to endure. Now, of course, as I talked about last week, exported across the sea by Arlene Foster's visit to an Orange March in Cowdenbeath, which sparked off some of the ugliest scenes in Scotland in recent years in this marching season, as it's called, which is a euphemism because it's not a marching season. It's an annual parade of ethno-religious supremacism. It's the Ku Klux Klan of our islands. And from my point of view, utterly deplorable involvement in what are equally sectarian crimes by so-called dissident Republicans is an equally disturbing turn of events. The loyalist paramilitaries have annually promised that they are now fully committed to the rule of law and the maintenance of a ceasefire, in which case who was firing on the emergency services and who is making and using these bombs. But most people in Britain, if they are paying attention, will say, I think, the same as me. We want nothing to do with this so-called culture of ethno-religious supremacism. These 6 counties should not even be in our country, in our state. And the quicker the people of Ireland, North and South, reunite, the better. That's my stand, John. You?
Well, you see, this is the next bit that I was coming to, because the Northern Irish border has always been the sticking point of the Brexit negotiations, something that we've discussed before. That the burning of EU flags in the street, as well as Irish flags, but that kind of goes on every year around this time. I think that if there is any whisper of a united Ireland, the so-called decommissioned weapons of Arlene Foster's commander-in-chief will be brought back out, and the combined loyalist military command will take up armed struggle once again.
Well, that's possible. That's possible, John, but they'll have to be faced down sooner or later. Indeed, the failure to face them down in the early 1920s is how we got in this mess in the first place.
Absolutely, completely. Yeah, all this is historical fact. But the fact of the matter is now 10 DUP votes are all that is keeping Theresa May in power. And the more that she kowtows to these people, and the fact that it hasn't been in the mainstream media, just shows how much she is protecting Arlene Foster and, as you say, their ethno-religious bigotry and their disgusting beliefs. I mean, this has to stop. It really does. And the firing on the police services, ambulance services, because they wanted to remove dangerous structures, it's just, I don't know, it's just not on. It really isn't.
You're right. Thanks, John. And don't be a stranger. Let's hear from Yanni in Swansea. Go ahead, Yanni.
Oh, hi, George. Look, firstly, just to say, love your show, and
thank you.
Really appreciate having people such as yourself broadening the debate and raising the pertinent questions.
Thank you.
Now, what I rang about a couple of things. Firstly, your earlier guest who mentioned, I think, some of the Eastern European countries, and mentioned Estonia and Latvia.
Yes.
I just wanted to. My partner is Estonian, and she's there at the moment, actually, and I've been a number of times, and I was a little bit surprised by his statement. I thought it might have been a little bit glib, to be honest. As far as I'm aware, there might be a sort of a lunatic fringy.
No, it's the state that does it, Yanni. It's not a lunatic fringe. The state, takes down Soviet-era war memorials to the Great Patriotic War, which we call the Second World War. The state allows and endorses commemorations of people who collaborated with the Nazi occupation.
Right. Okay. Well, that would be news to me, and that's why.
Doesn't mean everybody in Latvia or in Estonia are proto-fascists, of course, but the political power in these countries, and the point that John White was making, is that in Poland, in the Baltic states, in the Ukraine, political power is now in the hands of people who are seeking to revise the history of the Second World War. That's undeniable.
Okay, and so you know for a fact that I don't know about the other countries, but that the Estonian state actually commemorates some Nazi and SS collaborators.
It certainly permits the annual celebration.
Okay, I'm going to look into that and challenge my Estonian friends about it.
Yes, don't fall out with your wife about it on my account.
No, not at all. No. She's kind of, she'd be quite disgusted as well. And just another point on the Brexit thing. I voted in the end. I was 50-50. I was split down the middle. I ended up voting Remain. Almost for personal reasons, because I'm here on although I'm Australian, I'm here on a Greek passport, so I'm an EU national, and my partner's Estonian. So, we were kind of, what do we do? But so I kind of understand. I certainly have great sympathies with the Brexit argument, and also being of Greek background. But I just wonder, it's clearly we've been part of the EU for a long time. And the associations are, economic and cultural and political are quite intricate and tight. So, isn't it logical that it would take a hell of a lot of unravelling to exit properly, and to do it without it being just a mess? Do you agree with that?
No, I really don't. And moreover, the stepping into the swamp that these negotiations have become was a profoundly bad idea. That's why I said on the first day we should have left, because that's what the public voted for. And then once we left, other things could have been negotiated or merely de facto occurring. For example, if we had said we will not be putting any tariffs or barriers on goods or services coming from the EU unless the EU imposes such tariffs and barriers on us. That would have been a better way to proceed. But Yanni, you know what? I've got to take a break for some capitalist messages. Homage to the great American, Bruce Springsteen. Now, I've only got a quarter of an hour left, even less, and the great Ian Lee is on after me, so stay tuned to Talk Radio. Let me batter through as many callers and writers as I can. First, Julian in Reading. Go ahead, Julian.
Hello, George. You touched on it earlier, but where were these outraged masses when the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia was in London, or when Bibi Netanyahu was in London? Where were they? It seems like the focus is decided by someone, and we all take to the streets, but we should have been out there for those tyrants as much as, if not more so, than Donald Trump.
Yeah, it's a peculiar alchemy at work, but the mainstream media obviously plays a key role in it. They are totally opposed to demonstrating against the two individuals you mentioned, and most of them are totally in favour of demonstrating against Donald Trump, and it shows. But Trump's provocative and ignorant, oafish behaviour obviously riles, disgusts a lot of people. And so I stand by what I said at the beginning, that the vast majority of the hundreds of thousands who marched today on a weekday in the baking heat were doing so for the very best of intentions.
Mm-hmm. Well, I feel like a hypocrite myself because I was demonstrating against George Bush years ago.
You and me both.
Yeah, well, I did, but I never demonstrated against Obama. But looking back on it, the American president is the same person. It's the same face with a different mask every time, from Bush to Obama right through to Trump.
Yeah, very good point, and thanks for making it. Kevin is in Stoke-on-Trent. Go ahead, Kevin.
Hello, George.
Hi.
Nice to talk for the first time.
Very nice to talk to you. I see Stoke-on-Trent is the debt capital of Britain. Did you know that?
No, I didn't.
Stoke-on-Trent, the people in Stoke-on-Trent have the highest individual indebtedness of any place in the country. Sorry to break that news to you.
I can take that on board. I'm feeling it myself, actually. But what I wanted to say is Donald and Melania, the First Lady, should be flattered to share a cup of tea and a sandwich. And I'm guessing there were no bones in the salmon and without crusts with Her Majesty the Queen. However, with as much respect that I have for the President, I felt that he came across as the boss. We know he's a stern man. Our Queen personally poured a cup of tea. I mean, do we know, or does anyone know, if it was through a strainer like my nana used to do? Or is it PG or Yorkshire tea? I don't know.
I have no idea. Perhaps we should get the royal butler back on to deal with these crucial questions,
Maybe.
Kevin.
Personally, I would have to...
He probably had coffee anyway. They're kind of averse to tea, aren't they? The Yanks?
I don't know.
Didn't they throw it all in the harbour?
Even so, personally, I would have to bow down before letting Her Majesty know that I don't like much milk and just a bit of sugar. I like my tea strong.
Well, look, I hope one day, Kevin, you get that opportunity to take tea with the Queen. Thanks for the call. Ian in North Wales says, great show as usual. Let's hope we've seen the back of the detestable Boris Johnson, but I fear not. Calling Corbyn a mugwump was the height of hypocrisy. Corbyn is an honourable man whose views have been held for years and years. Johnson, on the other hand, changes sides at the drop of a hat. The very definition of a mugwump. Goodbye and good riddance, says Ian in North Wales. No show is complete without the dulcet tones of the lovely Norma in Bristol. Norma, welcome.
It's only short, George.
Welcome.
Like you with this Charlie Rowley and the Novichok.
Yeah.
I mean, I've been thinking, why does it take so long to find it in his house? Those investigators have been there all week.
Well, that doesn't make any sense, you see. If the bottle was in his house and he was taken to hospital as he was, when he was, under suspicion at least that he was a Novichok victim, it's inconceivable that this bottle was not found before today.
I mean, if it was hidden, George, who would have hidden it?
Well, if it was hidden, why was it hidden?
Exactly.
You see, the thesis that it was on a cigarette butt, which suffered from the flaw that I was, I think, the first to point out, that would require a dead smoker in the undergrowth somewhere, was always absurd. The thesis that these people, in this case Mr. Rowley, who was daily receiving a free injection of methadone at Boots the chemist at our expense, that he found a syringe somewhere and stuck it in his arm, is beyond absurd and ridiculous. Now that we know it was not a syringe or a cigarette butt or a vial or a tub, but a bottle that was not left in the undergrowth, in the park, but in his house, I'm afraid that complicates the whole plot even more considerably.
Well, yeah, I mean, they said it was probably like a little perfume bottle or something. But we really want to know lots more.
Well, and by the grace of God, he survived just like the Skripals survived. So presumably, because we now know he's talking to the authorities. And I think the authorities have to be a bit more consistent and a bit more quick in telling us what it is that he's saying.
Yeah, exactly. Anyway, well, I hope we find out soon and we find out the facts. We don't have fake news.
Well, I hope so too, but just don't hold your breath, Norma, because it's not good at our age to hold our breath that length of time.
My breathing's terrible.
Thank you, my lovely. Thank you very much indeed. Damien must study political policy 24/7, says a texter. He's a very, very clever man, Damien, and he should be in Parliament. Tauster says, according to the BBC 6 Music, the 5:30 news headlines, they found a bottle of Russian nerve agent Novichok. Aren't we lucky we have the BBC and don't need to think for ourselves? The good news, Tauster, is not really many people believe that. Dr. Fath says, George, the world is insane. We have these inept Charlie K. Rowley-like clowns in government, and people like yourself, Corbyn and Damien, who aren't. Thank you, Doctor. Mr. R says, enjoying your show as ever. Have they only just found the bottle of weapons-grade vodka, Novichok, or have scientists only just identified it? Either way, their sniffer dogs are crap. My asthmatic cat could do better. She smells bull poop, by the way. Damien says, I think, George, out of respect for that poor woman, Dawn Sturgis, it wouldn't be very appropriate to make fun by playing that song later. After all, she was a victim, so think of her family. Addiction can affect any of our kids. Indeed it can. Cornelius III says, I'm confused under Murdoch. You've adopted an anti-Obama stance, when at the other place you were in tears when Obama and Raul Castro reversed over 60 years of tension between the US and Cuba by restoring diplomatic ties. The problem with that, Cornelius, it is utterly untrue. And I opposed Obama from the day of his first crime. And that was quite early in his presidency. I have not just adopted an anti-Obama stance. As the record shows, you see, it's quite lucky, Cornelius, that everything I say, write and do, is on the record and can easily be traced. And on your overarching point, do you really think for the rather small wage that I get for working here on a Friday night for 3 hours, that who owns the station determines what I think and what I say? If you really think that, Cornelius, I actually don't want you listening to me. In fact, I'm banning you from listening to me. Don't listen to me again, because that, I'm afraid, is the ultimate insult. Fra says it's reported that Syria and Assad claimed recently that the UK was behind one of the chemical attacks in Syria. It put Skripal et al. Into sharp focus, a practice run for Salisbury in the Russophobia propaganda game. Peter says, it was so funny, just before England's last game, Sky News was interviewing some English fans in Moscow, and one of them said, listen, don't believe the media. Come here, it's brilliant, and the Russians are so friendly. The Sky reporter couldn't move fast enough to change the subject. Hilarious, but sad. I didn't see that, Peter, but what I've got to say about my colleagues next door at Talk Sport is they have been absolutely straight down the line that this World Cup in Russia has been the best World Cup any of them have ever experienced. Helen Lakin says, headlines, Novichok found in a bottle. What? Very convenient that. Are we seriously meant to be all that gullible? Whoever's scripting the Salisbury drama is writing a seriously rotten script, unless it's meant to be a farce. Best-selling fiction. And Ben Chod says Galloway is 100% cool. However, who owns Talk Radio? It's owned by Mr. Rupert Murdoch, Ben. And I'm quite grateful, as should you be, that I get the chance to talk to you entirely unfiltered, unedited, untrammelled by Murdoch or anybody else. Nobody in this building would dream of telling me what to say, what not to say. Wouldn't happen at the BBC, mate. Dr. Fath says Theresa May was gazing up at Donald Trump, similar to how you would have looked on Hayley Mills playing a double bass whilst wearing a wet Celtic T-shirt. Doctor, that's unbecoming of a man of your stature, and certainly would be unbecoming of a married man like me, whose wife is listening, indeed waiting downstairs to sweep him away into the night. What a brilliant call from the former royal butler, Grant Harold. I hope he gets to play himself in the movie, says Tony X, the protest board. Well, it's been marvellous for me. I hope it was for you, and if it was, come back again next Friday, God willing, at the same time, where I'll be back presenting what is surely the mother of all talk shows.
Talk Radio.